Hi guys, my name is Tom, I'm the Tech Chap, and this is my comparison video between the Apple Watch and the LG Urbane watch. Now, it's kind of weird having a bit of an Apple versus Android debate about watches, but here we are with two of the latest and greatest smartwatches on the market. But interestingly, there are actually two models of the new Urbane. There's an LTE and a non-LTE version. But the differences actually go a bit beyond that. For example, the LTE has a slightly different design. It has 3 physical buttons as opposed to 1. It's got a bigger battery, although it is heavier. But most importantly, it actually ditches Android Wear in place of LG's own operating system. So that's probably the biggest difference there. But this is just the normal non-LTE model, which I'll be comparing against the Apple Watch. Now, speaking of the Apple Watch, of course, there are 38 different models to choose from in terms of the Sport, Watch and Edition varieties and a whole bunch of different wrist straps. This is a pretty mid-range one. It's the Watch Edition, 38mm with a sport band. So this is, I would say, pretty mid-range, pretty typical watch that people might buy. Of course, the functionality doesn't actually change between the models, but just for overall aesthetic and design, I've gone for the mid-range one, which you're probably more likely to go for if you were to buy one. And you may already have seen the definitive review of this on my channel already, and if you haven't, then you should obviously go and watch that after this if you can. Now, these are obviously two of the best smartwatches on the market. We've got Android Wear versus iOS, we've got LG versus Apple, so it'll be pretty interesting to see how these compare. Now, although the differences between the LG Watch Urbane and the Apple Watch are pretty striking, they are both fantastic looking watches in my opinion. They're both pretty high-end, premium looking, but of course they have gone for very different designs. To me, the Urbane looks and feels a lot more masculine than the Apple Watch, primarily due to the significantly larger bezels around the edge. Both watches are made of stainless steel, although they both definitely look high-end and premium in their own different ways. So it's difficult to say which one I prefer overall. On the face of it, I do feel the Apple Watch is a little bit feminine looking, although the bigger 42mm model may reduce this a bit. Having said that, as much as I do like the look of the Urbane, it's a lot less comfortable to wear than the Apple Watch. It's very big, very bulky and very chunky. There's no mistaking it, the LG Urbane is huge and it just feels like a bit of a monster on my wrists. I'd say I have fairly small wrists perhaps, but it's huge on it. And is also not the most comfortable to wear. I think the Apple Watch is significantly more comfortable to wear, and actually I can forget about wearing the Apple Watch, whereas I always know the Urbane is on my wrist just because it keeps sort of pressing into my hand or digging into my arm a little bit. So both look high-end, both look premium, but the Urbane does come with by default as standard, a nicer wrist strap than the Apple one does. This is the silicone sport band in black, obviously, and I think the Urbane just looks a bit classier. And of course, you can match this sort of classy style and in fact exceed it on the Apple, but you're paying £80, $100 premiums for each sort of extra new level of strap you want to go for. So it's nice that the Urbane just comes as standard with a nice looking journeyman leather strap, and it sort of adds into the experience of a much more familiar watch experience with the Urbane. Personally though, neither exactly my cup of tea, and I think I'd really like something that's a bit in between the two in terms of style. Objectively though, they are both great looking, they're both well made and sturdy, the build quality is excellent, and so it really comes down to a personal choice in terms of style and design. Both feature P-OLED displays, so the whites are rich and the blacks are inky, and the colours are really vibrant on both devices. I must admit though, I did make a mistake in my Apple Watch review, as I quite boldly exclaimed that it was the sharpest smartwatch on the market. It isn't. This 1.3-inch Urbane offers 348 pixels per inch, a fair bit more than the 290 or 302 ppi on the 1.5 or 1.7-inch Apple Watches. So this is the 1.5, so this is a 290 pixels per inch. So the Urbane is a little bit sharper, is a little bit crisper than the Apple Watch, but you won't really notice that in real life unless you put it right to your eye and try and discern the individual pixels, which you can still do on both, of course, but the Urbane does win in terms of clarity. The biggest difference though is the Urbane just has a more natural round display, whereas the Apple Watch has a more typical square display. The LG's is also a fair bit bigger. Even though on the specification it's 0.2 inch smaller than the Apple, this is because it's round essentially, and this one's square, so the typical diagonal measurement doesn't really give you the full picture. In reality, the LG's display is noticeably bigger, and for me makes everything a bit easier to use, a bit less fiddly. Everything's just a bit easier to press. But of course that's also thanks in part to the Android Wear user experience. So I can't really fault either display, but I suppose the LG wins because it has a more natural, perhaps more familiar round display, and also is a bit crisper thanks to that high resolution. Now, in terms of performance, the Urbane sports a 1.2 GHz Snapdragon 400 processor and 512 megabytes of RAM, which is identical to the G-Watch R from last year. And the Apple Watch uses a custom S1 processor, which is reportedly similar in performance to the iPad 2 or iPhone 4S, and also uses 512 megabytes of RAM. But you know as well as I do that comparing Apple versus Android devices on specs isn't particularly useful, or of course indicative of real-world performance. It all comes down to the software. Although it is worth noting that the Apple Watch does offer double the storage of the Urbane with 8 GB of internal storage, so there's going to be plenty of room for more apps in the future. It's also interesting that the Urbane uses Gorilla Glass 3 to protect the display, whereas this version of the Apple Watch uses Sapphire Glass. Of course, the Sport model uses Ion X. So although I don't intend to start scratching these and see which ones is more resistant or scratch resistant or, I don't know, bulletproof, I think you can be fairly confident that they're both strong, they're both pretty resistant to scratches and nicks and things. But it will be interesting in the long term which one holds up better. Both have Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, although the recent Android Wear update, which actually is only available on the Urbane at the moment, means you only need to be within Wi-Fi range of your paired phone instead of Bluetooth, which the Apple Watch requires, which is a bit closer. Wi-Fi extends a lot farther than Bluetooth does, so that's a nice little feature, actually at this point in time exclusive to the Urbane. Functionality is broadly similar, of course, although the user interface is different. You've got this quite interesting new sort of app UI on the Apple Watch, whereas you have the familiar Google Cards and list view for apps and functions on the Urbane, and they both largely offer the same functionality. For example, they can both measure your heart rate, they can both track your activity, they can both check your stocks and messages and place calls. Although one thing I do like about the the Apple Watch that the LG doesn't have is it has a speaker and a microphone, so you can actually place calls on your Apple Watch and speak to people and hear them and talk to your wrist, which is kind of cool, although I'm not sure how often I'll be doing that in the real world. But it's nice to be able to have that option. Both UIs have their pros and cons. I'm not really a fan, particularly of the new app interface on the Apple Watch. I think it's a bit too small, a bit too fiddly, and you can often press the wrong thing. But I do like glances, which if you swipe up from the watch, you do get this list of glances which you can add to and edit. And I think they're quite good to use and easy to read. On the LG, we have the Android Wear cards, which if anyone's ever used an Android phone, I'm sure, or Google Now, you're going to be quite familiar with. Sometimes I do find myself getting a bit lost in the notifications on the LG, but I do prefer how everything's a bit bigger and a bit easier to touch all around. But of course, both do have physical buttons which act as home buttons, so if you do get lost, you can always come back to the watch face with a quick click of these. Finally, in terms of battery, the Apple has a 205 milliamp hour battery versus the LG's 410 milliamps. So the LG does have twice the battery capacity of the Apple, and in real world experience for me comes out as being about a third better, about a third longer in terms of battery performance, and that's quite a bit actually. The Apple Watch struggles to get a day. Maybe I'll get to the evening, I'll have about 10% left. The LG on the other hand will have a solid 30% left at the end of the day, so you can almost guarantee the LG will get through a full day. The Apple one, you have to ration a little bit, you have to be a bit more mindful of perhaps what you're using. So what strikes me most is just how different but also similar these two watches are. Obviously they're on different operating systems, but the functionality is near enough the same, give or take a few extra features. And obviously they go about them in slightly different ways. It looks a bit different user interfaces. But you know, for all intents and purposes, they are both smartwatches and they do what smartwatches do. So you don't get a great deal of difference in functionality. Now, in terms of design, obviously they've gone for very different looks, but they are both extremely good looking, both very premium. One's a bit more rugged, a bit more masculine, in my opinion. The other is a bit more feminine, I don't know if you'll agree or not. But obviously they are both great looking devices, very different, and it's going to be quite a personal choice, I think, which one you prefer. In terms of performance, they're both pretty equally matched. They're both quite responsive and fast and nice to use, but they could do with being a bit more stable in terms of the software and perhaps a little bit more powerful in terms of the hardware as well. You do get a little bit of stutter, a little bit of lag, and the occasional crashes on both devices, which is something you kind of occasionally expect from Android, but not so much from Apple. So that's a little bit more noticeable, for example, on the Apple Watch. But I would say they're pretty much on par for performance and they're on par for just user experience, obviously just in different ways. Now finally, LG has one more ace up its sleeve, and that's the price. This is about £250, and that's roughly half the price of the Apple Watch. Now, of course, you can get the cheaper sport model of Apple Watch for about £299, so only then a 50 quid difference, and the functionality is pretty much the same. In fact, it is exactly the same between all the Apple Watch models, but obviously it doesn't look quite as nice. The design and the look and feel isn't quite as high-end as some of the more high-end watches available. So whatever way you look at it, the LG is a fair bit cheaper than the Apple Watch. So which one should you buy? Well, it really only comes down to one question. What phone do you actually have at the moment? The Apple Watch requires an iPhone 5 or later, and the LG Urbane requires an Android 4.4 or later Android phone. So, we could look at these all day long. We could compare them, weights and specs and performance and functionality. But if you have an iPhone and you want a smartwatch, it's going to have to be the Apple Watch. If you have an Android phone, then out of these two, you're going to have to get the Urbane. So that makes it a little bit clearer, a little bit easier perhaps to decide. But I still think it's interesting putting these two together and comparing what the best of Android and the best of Apple have to offer. So this has been my comparison video between the LG Watch Urbane and the new Apple Watch. I hope you found it useful. If you want to find out more, you should check out my definitive review of the Apple Watch on my channel right now. And you should also subscribe, of course, to the Tech Chat, because in the coming days, I'll be releasing my full in-depth review of the LG Urbane as well. So thank you very much for watching. Please do subscribe and check out thetechchat.com and follow me on Twitter @thetechchat for more and to keep up to date. So cheers for watching, guys, and hopefully see you again soon.